And it's the real Richard that I'd like to talk to you about today, not the Richard of Tudor myth and propaganda, and certainly not the Richard of Shakespeare's play, nor yet the Richard of romantic historical fiction, but the real 15th century nobleman who had a very short but very eventful life. Richard was born on the 2nd of October 1452 in Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. His parents were Richard, Duke of York, who was descended from King Edward III, and his mother was Cecily Neville from the powerful northern family of Nevilles, and she was also descended from her Beaufort mother from King Edward III. So although when Richard was born, it was never expected that Richard would be King of England, he was certainly from the very high end of the nobility, the higher echelons of society. Richard was born into that troubled period in our history known as the Wars of the Roses, well, known later as the Wars of the Roses, it wasn't known as that at the time. Basically, the Wars of the Roses was a dynastic struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Both were descended from King Edward III, and it was a case of which house took precedence. Perhaps the family trees, if you have a look at those later, will explain that better. At the time of Richard's birth, it was a Lancastrian king who sat on England's throne, King Henry VI. He was the son of the famous victor of Agincourt, Henry V. But Henry VI had none of the warlike qualities of his father. Henry VI would rather have been a monk. He would have been much happier living the life of a medieval monk, who certainly wasn't the image of the warrior king. He was a very religious, pious man, and to be a warrior king wasn't really what he wanted to do, but he had no choice, and that's the position he was born into. That having been said, it certainly didn't apply to his Queen Margaret of Anjou, who was very much the warrior queen. Now, the House of York were far from happy with this state of affairs, that it was a Lancastrian king who sat on England's throne. The future Richard III's grandfather, Richard Earl of Cambridge, with some friends, had attempted to remove Henry V from the throne, to replace him with the Earl of Cambridge's Mortimer brother-in-law. Now, they had meetings, they'd made plans, but they weren't very decisive. And when Henry V found out about their plans, he was anything but indecisive, and they were executed. But it goes back that far, the problems between the House of York and Lancaster. Now, the future Richard III's own father, Richard, Duke of York, was deemed to be the heir to King Henry VI until he should have children of his own. So the cauldron of discontent was bubbling away quite nicely when in 1453, the year after Richard's birth, two things happened. King Henry VI completely lost his mind, he couldn't be reached by anyone, and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, gave birth to a son named Edward. Well, by March of the following year, Henry was still no better, and Richard, Duke of York, was nominated as Lord Protector, what we today would call a regent, until either Henry VI recovered his wits or his son should reach his majority. Henry VI did regain his wits in January of 1455, and the Queen's favourite Somerset was back in power, and the Duke of York and his relatives were out in the cold once again. Two parliaments were called, one for Westminster and one here in Leicester, and to neither of these parliaments was the Duke of York invited, which as Premier Duke of the realm he most certainly should have been. So the Yorkists were very unhappy, and the disgruntled Yorkists marched off to Yorkshire to raise an army. Somerset, in the name of the king, also raised an army, and the two forces met at St Albans on the 22nd of May 1455, and this was the first battle in a series of battles over the next 30 years that were to become known as the Wars of the Roses. This first battle was a victory to the Yorkists. Of course, our infant Richard was blissfully unaware how these battles would shape his life. In fact, we don't know a great deal about Richard's life until he's 7 years old. In 1459, Queen Margaret's army at Ludford Bridge defeated the Yorkists, and all they could do was flee. The Duke of York, Richard's father, and his second son Edmund went to Ireland, and the Duke of York's brother-in-law Salisbury and his son, the Earl of Warwick, and York's eldest son Edward fled to Calais. And this left Cecily Neville and her 3 young children, George, Margaret and Richard, at Ludlow Castle. So Richard, at not quite age 7, is a prisoner of war, along with his brother, his sister and his mother, under the charge of the Duke of Buckingham. The following summer, the Earls of Salisbury, Warwick and Edward Earl of March returned from Calais, and on July the 10th the opposing forces met at Northampton. The Duke of Buckingham was killed, and Cecily and her children were free once more. The Duke of York returned from Ireland in September, and he progressed to London, but on leaving Abingdon he wore the arms of England undifferenced, and he carried the Irish state sword before him. Now what this meant was that he was claiming the throne of England for himself. This is the arms of England at the time, and they have a label along the top. Now he'd taken the label off. Even today it is only the reigning monarch that can wear the arms of England undifferenced. Prince Edward, Prince Charles, Prince Andrew all have the label along the top. So what the Duke of York had done in taking the label off was saying that he had as much right to England's throne as the man who was already sitting there, King Henry VI. Now, unfortunately, the Duke of York hadn't discussed this even with his own close allies, so no one knew quite what to do. The usual thing, committees were formed, working parties were set up, and eventually the Great British Compromise was reached. King Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life, but the Duke of York would be named as Lord Protector and King Henry's heir. Now, King Henry might have been okay with this, but his Queen, Margaret of Anjou, certainly wasn't. She was not about to see her son disinherited. So the armies gathered once again. Christmas of 1460 saw the Yorkists at Sandal Castle with the Lancastrians 10 miles away at Pontefract. Now, a truce had been called over the Christmas period, but on December the 30th, the Duke of York and his second son, Edmund Earl of Rutland, and Salisbury's son Thomas were all killed, and the Earl of Salisbury executed the following day. The story is, we can't really verify it at this distance in time, but the story is that a group of Lancastrians had appeared outside Sandal Castle, and the Duke of York had some men out foraging for food. He valiantly but foolishly went out to rescue his men, and the main body of the Lancastrian army appeared, and they were hidden, and of course they were all killed. So Cecily Neville had lost her husband, her son, a brother and a nephew in one fell swoop. At this point she deemed it prudent to send her young sons George and Richard into exile into Burgundy for safety. So at the age of 8 years old, Richard has been a prisoner of war, the son of an attainted rebel. He's now fatherless and he's about to be sent into exile. So not the best of starts for any child, and today I'm sure social services will have an absolute field day. Fortunately for the House of York, eldest son Edward Earl of March, who is now 18, had spent Christmas at Shrewsbury, so he'd escaped from the carnage at Sandal Castle. And he raised an army which met the Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross on February the 2nd, 1461. This was a Yorkist victory. Now before the battle, a parhelion had been observed in the sky, and Edward took the 3 suns as a sign of the Trinity and an omen of good fortune, and after the battle he took the sun in splendour as his own personal badge. Now just to illustrate where the story of Richard differs from Shakespeare's play, In his play, Shakespeare has the three sons of the Duke of York, Edward, George and Richard, standing looking up at the sky at the three sons and saying, "Three sons for the three sons of the Duke of York, an omen of good fortune." Well, of course, we know that Richard was 8, George was 11, they weren't in the country, they didn't take part in the battle, they were in exile in Burgundy, but don't let a good story stand in the way of fact. After the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, a couple of weeks later, on February the 17th, the second Battle of St Albans took place, and the Earl of Warwick lost this to the Lancastrians, and he only narrowly escaped with his own life. Edward had been marching to join him, but he hadn't got there in time, so the Earl of Warwick was lucky that he managed to escape. The two forces, Edward's and Warwick's, joined up and they entered London, where men flocked to Edward's banner. Edward was proclaimed king on March the 4th, but another battle was going to have to be fought before he could actually be crowned. There was a marked contrast between Edward IV and Henry VI, the rather pale, shabby, shuffling Henry, in contrast to Edward, who, when his coffin was opened in 1789, the skeleton was found to measure nearly 6 feet 4 inches, which anyone over 6 feet today is considered a tall person. But at that time, he was incredibly tall. He was good looking, he was charismatic, and he must have looked quite godlike in his shining armour as he rode through the streets of London. So if today we were talking about an American election and who appeared better on TV, certainly Edward would win hands down against Henry VI. The Battle of Towton was fought on Palm Sunday, March the 29th, 1461. It took 10 hours in atrocious weather for the Yorkists to appear victorious. Henry VI, Margaret and their son escaped to Scotland, and later Margaret and their son sailed to France. It was now deemed safe for George and Richard to return from exile in Burgundy. Edward was crowned King Edward IV on Sunday, June the 28th, but not before he created 28 new Knights of the Bath, including his two young brothers, Richard and George. George was created Duke of Clarence and Richard Duke of Gloucester, and later on they would both be made Knights of the Garter. So Richard's fortunes are now on the up and up. He's gone from being the son of an attainted rebel living in exile to being the brother of an anointed king of England. Richard was sent to Midland Castle, the home of their ally, the Earl of Warwick, where he was taught the arts of war and knightly conduct. And this was where he first got to know Anne, the Earl of Warwick's younger daughter. Now, there's often a lot made of this, that they were childhood sweethearts and they later went on to marry. He would certainly have got to know Warwick's daughters because, as well as learning to be a knight, there would have been table manners, etiquette, dancing and this sort of thing, and presumably the Countess's daughters would have come into that. But whether there was any affection formed between the two, it's impossible to know. Certainly they would have known each other as children and they did later marry, but how much of a romantic story there is there, I wouldn't like to say. On May Day 1464, King Edward IV secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville. Now, Elizabeth wasn't exactly the sort of person that a King of England was expected to marry. Marriages at that time amongst the nobility were certainly all about power, position, land, wealth. And if you were a prince or a princess, then it was also about foreign alliances. So for Edward to secretly marry the widow of a Lancastrian, someone from a staunch Lancastrian family, mother was a royal from the House of Luxembourg, but her father had only been a squire. He was created a baron by Henry VI in 1448. But she was from relatively humble beginnings. She was already the mother of 2 sons, and she was 5.5 years older than Edward. So not the sort of person that Edward would have been expected to marry. Now, while Edward was already married, the Earl of Warwick was trying to form a foreign alliance for Edward with the French king's sister-in-law, Bona of Savoy. Warwick had rather led the French king to believe that although it was Edward who was king, it was Warwick who was in charge. Edward was a puppet and Warwick was pulling the strings. So of course, when negotiations had gone so far that Edward had to admit that he had actually already married, so Warwick's plans were somewhat out of the window. Warwick, as you can imagine, was not a very happy man, and this was the first rift between Edward IV and the Earl of Warwick, the man who had helped him to the throne. Warwick rather had egg on his face when he had to admit to the French king that in fact Edward was in charge and he'd actually gone and made his own marriage arrangements. In 1466, Henry VI was captured in Lancashire and taken to the Tower of London. In 1468, Richard's sister, Margaret, was married to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and this was the second rift between Edward IV and Warwick. Because Burgundy wasn't a part of France at that time, it was completely separate, and France and Burgundy were traditional enemies. So by Edward forming an alliance with Burgundy, having married his sister to the Duke of Burgundy, he was again going completely against Warwick's foreign policy, and Warwick wanted to ally England to France. So definitely the relationship between these two men was now in serious trouble. And at the same time, Warwick had been chatting to Edward's brother George. George at this time was still Edward's heir because Elizabeth hadn't yet produced a son. She produced daughters, but at this point no son. So George was still Edward's heir, and Warwick had rather got to George. I think George was probably suffering from second son syndrome. Why should Edward have all the goodies? Why should he be king and not me? I'm just as good looking as he is and I'm just as good a knight. And Warwick played on this, and he revived the rumour that perhaps Edward wasn't the son of the Duke of York, but the son of an archer, which would of course make George the rightful king. And Warwick promised George that if he married his elder daughter Isabel, then of course I will help you to the throne. George fell for it hook, line and sinker. He'd asked Edward's permission to marry Isabel Neville, and Edward had refused. But George nevertheless went ahead and married her secretly on July the 11th, 1469. Now, Edward had feared that Warwick was trying to make himself even more powerful than he was, and this was what Edward didn't want. And he proved to be correct, because George then joined his father-in-law, the Earl of Warwick, in armed rebellion against the king, his brother. King Edward's troops were defeated at Edgecote near Banbury on July the 26th. Queen Elizabeth's father and brother were executed, and King Edward himself was taken prisoner at Olney. Henry VI was in the Tower of London, so Warwick now had two kings in his power, hence where he gets the title Warwick the Kingmaker from. You've got Henry VI in the Tower of London, and Edward IV was initially held at Warwick Castle and then moved further north to Midland for greater safety. But Warwick had rather miscalculated. Edward was very popular in the country, and when a Lancastrian rising started, Edward's signature alone wasn't enough to bring men to arms. They needed to see Edward. And this gave Edward's loyal supporters, including his brother Richard, time to rally. It was around this time that Richard chose as his motto, "Loyalty me league, loyalty binds me." We believe that to be his loyalty to Edward, and he chose the white boar as his emblem. Warwick soon realised that he would have to release Edward, and at the beginning of October, backed by 500 loyal supporters, Edward returned to London. Exactly what part Richard played in this, we don't know. But on October the 7th, just 5 days after his 17th birthday, Edward made him Constable of England, so his loyalty was rewarded. Tensions flared again in 1470, and this time Edward had no doubt that his brother George had turned traitor with Warwick, and he offered £1,000 reward for their capture. Warwick and George fled to France to Louis XI's court, where against all the odds they joined forces with their former enemy, Margaret of Anjou. Now, Margaret realised that probably the only way she had of regaining her throne was to join forces with Warwick. And Warwick had little choice what to do either, as he'd now fallen out with Edward. But there's a rather nice little story, which may or may not be true, that Margaret kept the Earl of Warwick on his knees for over an hour while she deliberated on whether to join forces with him or not. Which poor old Warwick, every time he goes to the French court, he ends up being bitterly humiliated. He starts off by telling them how important he is, and then he ends up on his knees having to wait for a decision. Now, as part of this alliance, the Earl of Warwick's younger daughter Anne was married to Margaret's son Edward. Warwick and George landed back in England on September 13th. Edward gathered an army, but John Neville, the Earl of Warwick's brother, who had so far been loyal to Edward, now declared for his brother, the Earl of Warwick. So Edward had no choice but to flee to the court of his sister Margaret, now Duchess of Burgundy. Now Richard at this point had a choice. He could just as easily have thrown in his lot with the Earl of Warwick as his brother George had done, but he decided to stick with his brother Edward. He remained loyal to his brother Edward even when the going got tough. So the day after his 18th birthday, Richard is once more fleeing into exile. So far his life has been a complete seesaw of ups and downs, probably more downs than ups. Poor old Henry VI was taken out of the tower, dusted off, had his ermine and his crown put back on him again, and told that he was king once more, but not for long. Edward and Richard returned to England, landing on March 14th, 1471. The Duke of Burgundy had supplied them with a small force, but as Edward marched to London, men flocked to his banner. Edward rather had the support of the London merchants, and it always helped men to decide who they were going to support if there was money there to pay them. So as the merchants supported Edward, there was likely to be money, so that's the army to join. It was often that arbitrary. George, of course, was rather up the creek without a paddle by this point. He'd fought against his brothers, but on the other hand, he now wasn't part of Warwick's plans, because if Warwick's army was victorious, it would be either Henry VI or his son, Edward, married to Warwick's younger daughter, who would be on the throne. So George no longer featured in Warwick's plans, and also George had fought against his brother, so if Edward was victorious, where did that leave him? He decided the best thing to do was to throw himself on family loyalties and hope that the family forgave him, and that's what he did. He rejoined his brothers just outside Coventry. Now Richard was said to have had a part in this, and certainly George was Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy's favourite brother, and she had written asking George to rejoin his brothers. So that's what happened. The brothers went to London with Richard leading the procession, while Edward went to see his wife in sanctuary, who in his absence had given birth to a son, Edward, an heir for the House of York. Warwick's army and Edward's met at Barnet on Easter Sunday, April the 14th, 1471. Both Warwick and his brother John Neville were killed. Edward had relied heavily on Richard in this battle, giving him the vanguard. It was Richard's first full-scale battle, and Edward entrusted him with the vanguard, his crown, his kingdom, and his life. Edward took the centre, keeping George close by. It was never a bad idea to keep an eye on George. I think that's probably something Shakespeare did get about right. False, fleeting, perjured Clarence. Always a good idea to watch George. And William Lord Hastings, a local lad from Ashby Castle, he took the left wing, a great friend of Edward IV's. Richard had a hard time of it. One of his squires had been killed and he himself had been wounded in the fighting. But on the day of the victory at Barnet, Margaret landed from France at Weymouth, unaware of Warwick's defeat. Margaret was marching to Wales to join with the Tudors, but Edward cut her off at Tewkesbury before she could cross the River Severn. Margaret was taken prisoner and her son Edward was killed during the battle. Edward had kept his commands exactly the same as he had done at Barnet, with Richard again leading the vanguard. So it was Richard who had the honour of leading the procession through London on May the 21st, and Margaret was brought up the rear of the procession in a chariot. She would remain a prisoner in the Tower of London until 1475, when under the Treaty of Bikini she was returned to her native France. Henry VI still lived in the Tower of London, and he would always be a focus for rebellion. So it was fortunate for Edward that just at that moment he decided to die from pure displeasure and melancholy after the defeat at Tewkesbury and the death of his son. No, nobody believed it at the time either, and I can see from your faces you don't. When his coffin was opened in the 1700s, they seemed to like opening coffins in the 1700s, but they found that Henry VI had in fact got a dirty great dent in the back of his skull. Now, I don't think you usually get that from pure displeasure and melancholy. It has been put to me that he could possibly have died from natural causes, a stroke or a heart attack, and he fell and hit his head as he died. That's possible, but I do tend rather to believe that Edward gave the order for his death, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. But I definitely don't go with a pure displeasure and melancholy, really. Now, Richard asked his brother Edward's permission to marry the widowed Anne Neville. Well, how could Edward refuse? But George had her living with him and her sister, and Anne then seems to have mysteriously disappeared. George didn't want her to have a husband to fight for her rights. He wanted all the Neville lands for himself. He certainly didn't want his brother having half of them. Now, again, it's one of those nice little stories. We're not exactly sure what happened. We do know that Anne disappeared, but the story is that she was found working as some sort of cook maid in a house independent of George, Duke of Clarence. Richard is then said to have taken her to St Martin the Grand, to Sanctuary, until he married her. And Richard and Anne were married and returned to live at Midland, which was Anne's childhood home. In the following year, 1473, Anne gave birth to a son, Edward. Richard became Lord of the North, guarding the border for his brother against the Scots, and he rarely travelled south. He joined Edward on his expedition to France in 1475, which resulted in very little fighting and a pot of gold changing from French into English hands. And this culminated in the Treaty of Bikini, when Margaret of Anjou was returned to her native France. Richard gained a reputation in the north as a fair man, dispensing the same justice to rich and poor alike. Nor did the church escape, despite Richard's devotion to it. He prevented the church from using fish garths, which were huge nets or traps which clogged the river up so that navigation wasn't possible, and also it prevented the ordinary fishermen like you and I going and catching the odd fish for dinner with their lines and poles, and he prevented the church from doing this. In December of 1476, George's wife Isabel died shortly after giving birth. George blamed her devoted servant, Anne Correct Twynehome. He held a court and he actually had the woman hanged, taking the king's justice into his own hands. George then rather seemed to go off the rails completely. He accused Edward of trying to poison him. He revived the old story of Edward being the son of an archer, so that he, George, was really king. Eventually, Edward had him arrested and sent to the Tower. In due course, he was tried and sentenced to death, and George was executed privately in the Tower on the 18th of February 1458. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Shakespeare tells us that George was drowned in a tub of Malmsey wine. And in 1066 and all that, there's a lovely picture of George upside down in the butt of Malmsey wine with his feet flapping about. Now, it is just possible George was a bit of a zany character, and he certainly liked a glass of Malmsey wine. So it is just about possible that if he was given a choice of how to die, he did actually say, "Oh, drown me in a tub of Malmsey wine." My own belief is that somewhere along the line it's a mistranslation. He died in the wine, and people have taken that to mean he was upended in a vat of wine. I rather think he was probably given poisoned wine to drink, but that is just my belief. But his daughter, Margaret Pole, until her dying day, wore a charm on her wrist of a barrel, and there's a picture of it if you want to have a look at it later. So she certainly believed that her father's death had something to do with wine. So it's an interesting thought. Certainly somewhere along the way, George's death, wine was involved. As I say, I tend to suggest that perhaps he drank poisoned wine, but his daughter certainly always wore a charm of a barrel on her wrist. One of the last services that Richard performed for Edward was the war against the Scots. In the winter of 1479-1480, James III had violated the truce, and in the summer of 1480, Bamborough Castle was burned. Edward was ready for war, but in 1482 he got as far as Fotheringhay, and he realised that he would have to leave the fighting to his brother Richard. Edward was no longer the warrior king he once had been. He rather enjoyed some years of the wine, women and song type lifestyle. He put on a lot of weight, he drank far too much, and he really wasn't fit any longer to undertake something like the siege of Berwick. So Richard had to get on with it. By the end of July, Richard had taken Edinburgh, and after a long siege, Berwick fell to him on August the 24th. Edward was overjoyed, and Richard spent Christmas of 1482 in London at his brother's court. But Richard wasn't happy there. He didn't like what his once warrior king brother had become, something of a drunkard and a glutton, and he didn't like the intrigues of the court. When Parliament met on January the 20th, 1483, Richard was rewarded for his loyalty. Edward gave him more lands and complete power over them. He now virtually had his own kingdom and power base in the north. At the conclusion of Parliament on February 20th, Richard went home, and this was to be the last time that he saw his brother Edward alive. Edward died on April the 9th, 1483. It was Edward's wish that Richard should be Lord Protector, a regent, until his son Edward was old enough to reign. Edward's eldest son was at Ludlow Castle, and news reached Richard at Midland that despite Edward's wishes, the Queen's relatives were set on ruling the country in the name of the new king and cutting Richard out. The King's old friend, William Lord Hastings, warned Richard, and the Duke of Buckingham also offered his support. Richard rode south with Buckingham, and they met at Northampton. They took charge of the young Prince Edward at Stony Stratford. Queen Elizabeth fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. They entered London on May the 4th, the day that the Woodvilles had planned to crown the young king. Richard went to his mother's residence, Baynard's Castle. Before May the 19th, young Edward was installed in the Tower in the state apartments, as was normal before his coronation. We tend to think of the Tower as a prison, but it was far more than that. In fact, to be imprisoned in the Tower, you had to be nobility, you had to have money. I certainly would never have made it into the Tower. It was a prison, it was the state apartments, it was the armoury, it was the mint, it was like a mini city. So although today we just think of being sent to the Tower as a prison, it wasn't that, and it was perfectly normal for people to be sent to the state apartments before their enthronement. The new coronation was set for June the 22nd, robes were ordered and coins were minted in the new king's name. Everything was full steam ahead for the coronation. On June the 5th, Anne joined Richard, now at his London home, Crosby Place. Their son was considered too delicate to travel. Two things then happened that were to change everything. Bishop Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, went to see Richard around June the 8th, and he told him that Edward had been pre-contracted to the Lady Eleanor Butler, the daughter of Lord Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. He wasn't therefore free to marry Elizabeth Woodville when he had been. So the marriage was therefore illegal and invalid, and the children of that union were illegitimate and therefore unable to inherit the throne. On June the 10th, Richard sent for an armed force from the north as he had discovered a plot against his life. Certain lords in the council were plotting with the Woodvilles against him. Thomas Lord Stanley, who was now married to Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, Rotherham, John Morton, and more surprisingly, William Lord Hastings had now thrown in his lot with the Woodvilles. Richard called a council meeting for June the 13th at 10 o'clock. Straight away he accused these lords of plotting with the Woodvilles to overthrow his protectorship and kill him. Morton and Rotherham were taken initially to the Tower, Lord Stanley was placed under house arrest, and William Lord Hastings was executed. On June the 16th, a delegation headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Howard went to Elizabeth Woodville in the sanctuary and persuaded her to give up her young son, Richard Duke of York, to join his brother in the Tower. On June the 22nd, Bishop Stillington's revelations were made public. On the 25th, a joint session of the Lords and Commons met at Westminster and unanimously approved offering the crown to Richard. This was the Act of Parliament known as Titulus Regius. The following afternoon, a delegation offered the crown to Richard at Baynard's Castle. He accepted and dated his reign from that day, June the 26th. And he and Anne were crowned on July the 6th, 1483. After the coronation, they set off on a progress around the country, and their young son, Edward of Midland, was invested as Prince of Wales at York on September the 8th. In October, the Duke of Buckingham rebelled. He was in touch with Henry Tudor through Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort. Tudor was in exile in Brittany, and he sailed from France, but atrocious weather and bad organisation put an end to Buckingham's rebellion. So on that occasion, Henry Tudor never even set foot on English soil. He sped back to France. Buckingham was betrayed by one of his tenants, captured at Shrewsbury and taken to Salisbury Marketplace, where he was executed on November the 2nd, 1483. On Christmas Day of 1483, in Wren Cathedral, Henry Tudor promised to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, and thus he hoped, when he had taken the throne of England, to unite the houses of York and Lancaster. During 1483, the two sons of Edward IV, known to history as the Princes in the Tower, disappeared from view. What happened to them? I can't tell you, no one can. No one knows for certain what happened to them. But what I'm going to do is give you a few theories that have been put about over the years, and I'll leave you to decide what you think happened to them. Now, for many, many years, it was said as fact that Richard III had murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower. Horrible Uncle Richard. Well, okay, they were likely to be a focus for rebellion, so Richard had them killed. But if Richard had them killed, why didn't he say, oh dear, here are the princes, they died of a fever? They were only any use to him dead if they were seen to be dead. It's like Henry VI, nobody believed that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. But Edward put that out and he had a dead body, so there weren't going to be any more rebellions in favour of Henry VI because he's dead. So for the princes to be of any use to Richard dead, they had to be seen to be dead. And if Richard felt the need to do away with the sons of Edward IV, why didn't he also feel the need to do away with Edward, Earl of Warwick, George of Clarence, his older brother's son? Because he would be before him in line to the throne as well. Certainly Henry VII did away with him when he came to the throne. Henry VII, now there's another interesting fellow. When he came to the throne, he repealed the Act of Titulus Regius, which had given Richard the throne and made Edward IV's children illegitimate. Now, Henry had that repealed and all copies destroyed. We only know of it because a copy turned up in the Tower of London during the reign of Charles II. So this made his queen, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, legitimate again. But if her brothers, the princes in the Tower, were alive, this also made them legitimate and very dangerous to Henry VII, because if they were legitimate, they had far greater claim to the throne than ever Henry did. So perhaps Henry had them killed. He certainly felt the need to get rid of an awful lot of people with Plantagenet blood in their veins. Why not the princes? And then there's Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. He had opportunity as Constable of England while Richard was on his coronation progress. Did he really rebel on behalf of Henry Tudor, or did he remember that he too was descended from Edward III and had a not inconsiderable claim to the throne himself, and certainly with a large amount of royal blood? Or did he act on Richard's instructions, or thought that he did? And then there's the Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. She wanted England's throne for her son. She'd arranged for Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, to marry him. Now, if the princes were dead and Richard defeated in battle, it rather cleared the way to the throne for her son. So was she the instigator, with perhaps the help of the Duke of Buckingham, who was, after all, her nephew? And then there's another theory, that the princes, in fact, were never murdered, but they were taken out of the country for safekeeping by Richard or somebody like Edward Brampton, the Portuguese Jew, acting on behalf of Richard. We do know that the elder boy did not enjoy good health. Dr. John Argentine was always visiting him. Perhaps he did die. But what of the younger boy, Richard, Duke of York? The pretenders that plagued Henry VII, could one of them actually have been the younger of the two princes in the Tower? Elizabeth Woodville's actions are curious if she knew that both of her boys were dead. In March of 1484, with her daughters, she came out of sanctuary and she went to Richard's court. And she wrote to her son by her first marriage, Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, telling him that it was safe to come home to Richard's court. Now, would she have done that if she'd have believed that Richard had murdered her two sons by Edward? And would she later have got involved in a plot against Henry Tudor, her daughter, now being married to him, and his queen, if she didn't believe that at least one of her sons was alive? And for her part in that, Henry packed her off to Bermondsey Nunnery. Now, we also have to consider that one person who pretended to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes, had the support of the Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret, Edward and Richard's sister, and he also received support from the Kings of France and the King of Scotland. The King of Scotland even marrying him to a relative of his own. So could Percy Warbeck actually have been who he claimed to be, Richard IV of England? I'll leave you to decide. In January of 1484, Richard held his first and only Parliament. Now, Richard was responsible for several acts being passed which involved the rights of the common man. The Land Tenure Act helped to safeguard men from having their property rights taken away from them. It helped to stop people being sold land which had already been sold or partially sold to somebody else. I mean, today we wouldn't be very happy if we bought a house and found that in actual fact we didn't own it, somebody else had already bought it. And Richard introduced the system of bail. So if any of you good people are ever arrested for some terrible crime, wrongfully arrested, of course, I might add, and you're thrown in jail and you are subsequently granted bail, this is down to Richard III. Because during Richard's reign, it was quite, before Richard's reign, it was quite normal for somebody to be arrested and thrown in jail for perhaps a couple of years before their case came to court and eventually they could be found innocent. So Richard introduced a system of bail. He also tried to get honest and unbiased juries. Officials were forbidden to choose any juror who was not of good name and fame and who was not in possession of freehold land worth 20 shillings a year. Sheriffs and bailiffs failing to obey this law were to be fined 40 shillings. You remember the Duke of Clarence had Antoinette Twinehoe found guilty by a hand-picked jury, men who were dependent on him for their livelihood, and she was found guilty and hanged. Well, this is something that Richard was trying to do away with by having non-corrupt juries and this kind of thing. And all convictions made by unqualified juries were to be declared void. And then just to show that absolutely nothing changes, our cloth manufacturers were very worried about cheap imports from abroad. They were concerned that cloth had been stretched only to shrink later. Well, there's no change there, is there? If you've not put on weight since last season, ladies, it's shrunk in the wardrobe. And they were also concerned about the use of cheap dyes which faded later. Well, as we know, yes, they fade into the washing machine, don't they? And everything comes out the same colour. So over the years nothing changes. We could just as readily be hearing that in 2013. In April, Richard and Anne went to Nottingham Castle, and there they received the news that their only son, Edward of Middleham, had died. Both parents were inconsolable. In August, Richard had Henry VI's remains removed from Chertsey Abbey to Windsor as a more suitable resting place for a King of England. The summer was spent preparing the fleet for Tudor's expected invasion. By Christmas of that year, it was obvious that Queen Anne Neville was dying. On March 16, 1485, Queen Anne died, we think, from consumption. And Richard openly wept at her graveside in Westminster Abbey. And if I may, I'd like to read you the letter of condolence that Richard received from the Doge of Venice on May the 2nd. A few days ago we received the sad news that Queen Anne, your beloved consort, had deceased. We, together with our Senate, mourned greatly, for we bear your Majesty so much love and goodwill that as we rejoice at any prosperous event that befalls you, so are we partakers of your sorrows. We exhort your Majesty, endowed with consummate equanimity and marvellous virtues, of your wisdom and grandeur of mind, to bear the disaster calmly and resign yourself to the divine will. And be it your Majesty's consolation that your consort led so religious and Catholic a life, and was so adorned with goodness, prudence and excellent morality as to leave a name immortal. Far more eloquent than the with sympathy cards we get today, isn't it? In June 1485, Richard moved to Nottingham, being roughly the centre of the country, to await Henry Tudor's invasion. On August the 7th, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven. He marched under the Red Dragon banner of Cadwallader. Richard called up his battle captains, including the Stanleys. Lord Thomas's son, George Lord Strange, was deputising for his father on Richard's council, and he chose that moment to leave. He was apprehended. He admitted that his uncle, Sir William Stanley, was in league with Tudor. George was now definitely a prisoner. The Stanleys met with Henry Tudor, but would not finally commit themselves either to him or to Richard. Richard and his troops left Nottingham for Leicester, arriving at sunset on the 19th. Richard stayed by tradition at the Blue Boar Inn in High Cross Street. He rode out from Leicester on the 21st for what was to be his last battle on Redmore Plain. Again, the story is that as he rode out over Bow Bridge, his foot struck the bridge, and the old wise woman standing by it said, "Ah, your head'll strike it on the way back." All words similar in meaning. Both armies were up and buckling on harness before first light on August the 22nd, 1485. Richard wore a gold circlet on his helm, which marked him out as king. His friends warned him of the danger, but Richard had lost his wife, his child, and he wasn't about to lose his kingdom. At previous battles, the Battle of Shrewsbury, Henry IV had several of his followers dressed up as himself, and Hotspur thought he'd killed several Henrys that day, but he hadn't killed any of them, and it was Hotspur himself that was killed. But it wasn't unusual, but Richard marked himself out as king. He was proud of being King of England. He'd lost everything else, and if he was going to lose his kingdom, then he was going to go down fighting. No more was he going to go into exile. Lord Stanley was called to arms if he valued his son's life, to which Lord Stanley replied, "I have other sons." "Thanks, Dad." That must have really made George feel good. Now, Richard, in theory, had advantages. He was a seasoned battle captain and he had superior numbers. But of course, no one quite knew what the Stanleys were going to do. The Duke of Norfolk held the vanguard, Richard had the centre, and Northumberland the rear. When Norfolk was killed and his son injured in the fighting, Richard ordered Northumberland to bring up his troops. But Northumberland refused, saying he must protect the rear from the Stanleys. Now Richard saw a chance. If he could just get to Henry Tudor and kill him, then it would be all over. He took with him his household knights, not more than 100 men. He got past William Stanley's men, he unhorsed Sir John Cheney, and he actually killed William Brandon, Tudor's own standard bearer. He got that close. But just at that point, William Stanley came in on the side of Tudor, surrounding Richard and his followers and cutting him off from the main body of his enemies, the main body of his army. Richard died refusing a fresh horse to flee the field. Please forget Shakespeare's a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Richard died fighting valiantly, refusing the horse and crying treason. Even the official Tudor historian Polydore Virgil wrote, "King Richard alone was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies." Richard's naked body was flung over a horse, covered in blood and filth from the battlefield, and taken back to Leicester. Again, traditionally his head struck Bow Bridge, as the old wise woman had suggested it would on the way back. His body was displayed for a couple of days outside St Mary of the Annunciation before being buried in the Greyfriars Church. So died a soldier, a statesman, a lawmaker, and a truly brave and loyal man, the last Plantagenet King of England. And I'd like to leave you with the words that the City of York dared to record in their council minutes after Tudor's victory at Bosworth. "King Richard, late lawfully reigning over us, was through great treason piteously slain and murdered to the great heaviness of this city." Thank you. Questions, I will do my best, and if you want to have a look at the pictures of the people that we've been talking about, then please do.
Well, I'd just like to thank Sally for a very, very interesting talk. It was really nice, the ones that were here earlier, tying the two together, and how much Sally and Liz were sort of talking about Richard the man, and again on the battlefield, being really corroborated that he was, as a knight of the time, Sir Richard was, as we said in the thing, a man of his time. So thank you very much. The music that's been sort of playing in the background is actually from Richard III's time. It's one of the CDs we had with music from that period. So we just thought as a gentle sort of thing, and to sort of hide some of the noise of the library working around you. It'd be interesting. So we are there for you to borrow. We have got the innocuous feedback forms, which we really appreciate if you could make some comments, just what you thought, helps us plan for future events. Or if you don't want to fill in the form, just some sticky notes. As Sally said, any questions, it's all, you're welcome to ask her. And also there's still some of the artefacts that Liz has stayed behind, that she brought over from Bosworth. Okay, thank you.